All right, let's start now. Okay, good morning, everyone. By my watch, it's 10 o'clock Singapore time. Welcome, everyone. Welcome to National Geographic Learning's third Best Practice webinar. So we are both live on Facebook, and also we have around 110 teachers in this webinar room, and there are more teachers coming in. Okay, so for the attendees in this Zoom webinar, please do remember to set your chat to all panelists and attendees so that everyone can see your messages. And for those who are watching live on Facebook, our presenter will not be able to see your comments, but my colleague Andrew Tiffany is monitoring there. So do also participate and also answer your questions and leave comments on Facebook. So now I'm going to introduce our presenter today, Christine Lee. Christine has worked in English language teaching for over 25 years. His roles have included teacher trainer, curriculum developer, materials writer, director of studies, school owner, consultant, and author. He has wide experience in English language teaching, but specializes in academic English and also exam preparation. He is the author of a dozen textbooks, including some by National Geographic Learning, for example, 21st Century Communication, World English, and Pathways, Listening, Speaking, and Critical Thinking. So thank you very much, Christine, for being here with us. And now I will hand it over to you.
Thank you, Kitty. Just share my screen with everyone. Hopefully you can now all see that.
Yes.
That's great. I had a horrible moment when Kitty showed that photo of me because I thought, am I wearing the same shirt? Because that would look like I only have one shirt, but I've got two, and luckily I chose the other shirt today. So, whew. So yes, good morning to everyone, or good evening if you're in the same time zone as me. I'm here in Canada. It's 9 o'clock in the evening. So if I start yawning, that's because it's 9 o'clock in the evening, not because I'm boring myself, hopefully. So today we're going to be talking about pathways to exam success. And I think in one sense, test classes are easy to teach. If we're helping somebody to try and take the TOEFL exam or IELTS exam or TOEIC exam, those classes are easy to teach because teachers only have one task. And what is that task, please? Can you share your thoughts in the chat window, please? I can see some very good answers coming through. And I think I've seen quite a few that are giving what I think is the right answer. And the right answer is, the right answer according to my presentation is that our job is to raise students' test scores. Some of you said we should help them to pass, and that would be great if we can do it. But passing depends on the student, depends on the test. But I think we can certainly try to raise students' test scores. And if we've done that, we've done a great job. So it's easy, right? That's our job. We just have one job, raise students' test scores. But obviously that's easier to say than it is to actually do. So let's see if we can think of some ways to help students to raise their scores in an engaging, interactive way. As Kitty suggested, I've been working in this industry for a long time. In fact, I've been in English language teaching for about 26, 27 years, and in teaching for 28 years. And during those years, I've spent probably about 22 really specializing in exam teaching. And particularly with exam teaching, I've had quite a few different roles. I spent many, many years as a teacher of exam classes. I became a teacher trainer for exam classes. I, in fact, developed my own teacher training program for helping teachers help students to do better in exams like TOEFL, IELTS, and TOEIC. I was a school owner. I started my own school here in Toronto, Canada, specializing in exam classes. I'm a writer. Kitty suggested I've written about a dozen books. In fact, it's a little bit more than that now. And about half of the books I've written are exam books. They're exam practice test books or skills books, that kind of thing. I'm also an item writer for a test. I'm not allowed to say which test, but I write the questions that students will take when they take the test. And I'm also an examiner. Again, I'm not allowed to say which test, but when students take the writing test or the speaking test, I'm one of the people whose job is to judge whether this gets this score or this score. And of course, in my life, I've been a student many times and I've taken these kinds of tests. I've taken GMAT and GRE and things like that. So from all those perspectives, I've thought about tests, how to help students, how to help myself. And I'm going to try and share some of the things that I've learned over the years of teaching and training and so on, share with you today. And I think that one of the challenge is that when it's trying to raise students' test scores, it can be quite difficult. And I think there are 4 principal reasons why it can be difficult to raise students' scores. Obviously, the test itself is going to be challenging. Whichever test it is, whether it's IELTS or TOEFL, it's difficult. It's difficult in many ways that we'll be discussing later today. And students make mistakes, of course. And some of them, those mistakes are ones that we can't expect students to avoid. But I think sometimes students make avoidable mistakes. And those are the ones that will often reduce their score because they're things that they could be getting points and they're not. Students have many gaps in their knowledge, and that will affect them, affect their ability to raise their score. And then students sometimes don't do the necessary work. I want to be clear, I'm not saying students don't work hard. I think for exam classes, students often work very hard. They know how important it is to get that test score. But sometimes the work they do isn't moving themselves forwards. I've had many students, for example, who really wanted to improve their vocabulary. They felt vocabulary was holding them back. So they studied vocabulary words and words and words. And that, it can be helpful if you're lucky. But I don't think being lucky is really a good thing to be in a test. I think you need to be focusing on the things that are actually definitely going to help you rather than the things that might possibly help you. So in today's session, we're going to be doing 2 things. One is to discuss some principles, some approaches to raising students' test scores. These are based on my 20+ years of experience in all those aspects of teaching tests. And we're going to be exploring how pathways, the second edition of pathways, can help us to apply these principles and approaches to deliver engaging, interesting classes. So let's go on to the first principle, which is to fill students' knowledge gaps. I think in my experience, students generally have 3 kinds of gaps in their knowledge. Language gaps, of course. The things that students don't know about English can affect their ability to answer questions correctly. There are what I call test gaps, which is gaps in students' knowledge of what the test is, how to take the test, and things like that. And then there are thinking gaps. Students struggle with certain aspects of thinking, and those aspects of thinking are very important for raising students' scores. Now, if there are gaps in knowledge, there's an obvious way to deal with this. And here's my model, very advanced, very technical. I'll give you a little bit of time to follow this. 2 stages: you find a gap, you fill it, you repeat. Pretty simple. And yeah, I mean, of course, that's one way we could do this, but I think this very simple approach is perhaps not the best way to do it, because not all gaps are equal. Some gaps are really important. I call these critical gaps because they're critically important, vitally important for raising students' scores. If we fill these gaps, we're probably going to help students to raise their score or to give them an edge or an advantage. But I think there are other gaps that we probably don't want to fill, either because it's just a waste of time, filling this gap is not actually going to help students, or it may even reduce student scores. And that would be the exact opposite of what we want to do as teachers. I'll give you some examples of these in a moment. So I think it's fairly common sense, but we should try and fill gaps that will positively impact students' test scores. Anything that will raise their score or give them an opportunity to get a better score, those are the gaps we should be filling. And so we have a little bit more complex model. We find a gap and we ask a question. Is it a critical gap? Is it a gap that really needs to be filled? If the answer is yes, we fill the gap and we find another gap. And if the answer is no, well, we decide not to fill that gap. We go straight back to find another gap that may be critical that we do need to fill. Now, when we talk about language gaps again, those critical gaps, the ones that we really need to fill, there could be 4 types. Obviously, grammar. There can be gaps in students' knowledge of grammar. And these are 2 possible types of gaps. One is productive gaps, where students don't have the grammar to be able to write or speak accurately and naturally. And the second gap is perhaps more of a receptive gap, where students don't understand the grammar when they're answering a grammar question in a test like TOEIC, for example, or they may not understand the grammar in a reading passage for IELTS or TOEFL, and that can affect their ability to comprehend what's happening. There are vocabulary gaps, of course, and we're going to be talking a lot about that in just a moment. There are pronunciation gaps. It's quite hard to make a grammar mistake that can really confuse someone. For example, if I say, yesterday I went to shopping, you all know what I meant, even though the word to is unnecessary there. But if I say, yesterday I went to chopping, chopping, instead of shopping, you're going to be confused. Well, chopping, what were you chopping? Chopping wood? Why were you chopping? So pronunciation can actually be a really important gap. If students don't have the pronunciation knowledge or ability, it really can affect their score quite a lot. And then there are punctuation gaps. Again, problems with punctuation can really confuse the reader, and that can make things difficult for students to get the best score. So with all of these different possible gaps, let's look at an example of a gap that perhaps we don't want to fill. Past perfect, the grammar tense past perfect, is one that students struggle with often. They don't know how to use it exactly. They may not quite understand the meaning when they see it. But even though it's a clear gap, I don't think we should probably fill this gap. And there's a few reasons. The first one is simply that past perfect is not common. It's not common for students to see it, and it's really not common in spoken or written English. I saw a research study that analyzed thousands and thousands of student essays, academic essays, and past perfect appeared in less than 1% of sentences. Now that means it's a really not very useful structure to teach students. And one of the reasons for that is that we can often use past simple instead. If we've got 2 past simple verbs with appropriate time markers, then it's very likely that the person will be able to understand the order of events, and the past perfect is just not needed. And even if we do decide we're going to fill this past perfect gap, and we give our students all the knowledge they need to understand and use the past perfect correctly, probably they won't actually use it correctly all the time. They may try to use it incorrectly sometimes. They may try to use it when they don't need to use it. And both of those things could actually reduce their score in the test because they would be making mistakes that are avoidable. So I'm going to say that perhaps we don't want to fill past perfect. Now, gerunds and infinitives are, I think, maybe something that we should be looking at more closely. These are actually useful to fill if there is a gap in students' knowledge. But when we talk about gerunds and infinitives, most textbooks will cover them in comparison. So we've got gerunds and infinitives with this verb, and gerunds with this verb, and infinitives with that verb. And the idea is that students have to learn these lists of verb plus gerund, verb plus infinitive, or verb plus both gerund and infinitive. And that's fine. It's useful, it's very clear, but it's not perhaps the most useful gap with gerunds and infinitives that we could fill. Native speakers, very, very common in spoken English or written English, they use gerunds or infinitives, especially gerunds, as the subject of a sentence. Example, attending a webinar is a good way to improve your knowledge of a subject, hopefully. And that structure is very commonly used by native speakers, especially in academic language, but it's rarely used by students. And because it's rarely used by students, it's perhaps a gap that we could try and fill. Now, I can't say too much, but when I'm acting as an examiner, if I see or hear gerund used as a subject, it's noticeable because most students don't use it. So if I have a student who starts to use this structure, I'm kind of impressed. And I take that into account when I'm giving that student the score. Oh, that student used this structure. That's quite advanced. That's quite unusual. That student might be better than other students. And therefore, that student might get a better score. We can also use very commonly gerunds as objects of prepositions. Now, students know this to some extent. I'm thinking about doing something. That's not a difficult structure for students. But in my experience, students have rarely been taught that this is an absolute structure that's common in English. They've learned a few examples, but they're not doing this systematically. And I think if we were to teach that, when you've got a preposition, you follow it with a gerund, it's very common, it's very natural, and it opens up a lot of interesting sentences. And I think this is definitely a gap that we should try and fill in students' knowledge for the same reasons. It's likely to be impressive to the examiner, and that might raise students' scores. Now, when we come to vocabulary, every single student in the world, even native speakers, have gaps in their vocabulary. And again, I think we can make a distinction between words that are useful for receptive understanding. When students read something or when students listen to something, we want them to be able to understand, and they need vocabulary for that. There are also words that are going to be useful for production when students are writing or speaking. And they're not the same. Receptive words are great if students get that word in the test. But there's so many possible topics in the test that it's very, very difficult to give a really useful list of receptive words. But for writing and speaking, I think we can be a little bit more likely to say what's going to be on the test. In IELTS, for example, the essay task, writing task 2, is very much focused on sort of familiar everyday topics, and it's the same in the TOEFL test as well. So because those topics are a little bit more predictable, I think we can be giving students kind of vocabulary that's going to be useful for production, for writing and speaking. And the great thing is that, of course, these words that are useful for productive English are also useful for receptive English. So my advice, if we're going to fill vocabulary gaps, let's try to focus on words that are very useful for writing and speaking, rather than words that are really only going to be useful for reading and listening. And then if we are going to be teaching this productive lexis, this vocabulary for production, my recommendation is to focus on words that are in what I call the sweet spot. Words that are in the sweet spot have two criteria. One is that they are advanced enough so that when students use these words, they sound good or it looks good in their writing. But the other criterion is that they're not so advanced that these words are hard to use, that students are going to sound artificial or too high, too formal. So we're looking for that sort of balance. And I'm curious if you could chat for me in the chat box, what CEFA level is the sweetest spot in your opinion? A1 words, A2 words, B1 words, B2 words, C1 or C2? And we're thinking specifically about tests like TOEFL or IELTS. Where would you say is the sweet spot? I'll have a look in the chat. My chat window keeps disappearing, so hopefully I can find it again. Here we go. Lots of answers coming in. I've seen everything from A1 up to C2. I can't say anything is wrong, but in my experience, C1 words are good, but B2 for me is the real sweet spot. B2 words are going to sound pretty good. They're going to be advanced enough that students are feeling confident and the examiners are thinking that these words are pretty good, there's a really wide range of B2 words. So students can have a really broad vocabulary if they're only using B2. Once you get up to the C words, the C1 and the C2, those words are a little bit more difficult to use. They're not quite as natural. They're not quite as frequent. They're quite small. The range of words in C1 and C2 is less. And so students are going to have a more limited vocabulary if they're focusing on those words. So for all sorts of reasons, I think B2 is really where we want to focus. And if we can do that, if we can give students this really good foundation of B2 words, they're going to be doing better in the test because they're going to be able to produce language more naturally, and they're going to be seeing a lot of B2 words as well. Now, when we talked about language gaps, we're going to come on now to what I call the test gaps. And I think there are three possible gaps here. The first type of gap is a gap in test content. Students are not familiar or not sure what topic is going to come up. And we've already touched on this. It's really difficult to say what topics might come up because in a test like IELTS or TOEFL, there's so many possibilities. I've actually done a couple of analyses of past papers of these tests to try and work out which topics are more common. And I can say that psychology comes up a lot. Economics is very, very common. And for some reason in TOEFL, marine biology seems to be really, really popular. I think there are people at ETS who like marine biology. But apart from that, it's almost impossible to judge which aspect of a topic will come up. So there's very little we can do about filling students' gaps in test content knowledge. We can give them a lot of confidence to be able to answer questions, and that's what we should try and do here. There are also gaps in the test format. Students don't know what item types they're going to get, how many sections there are, how many questions there are, how much time it takes to answer these questions, and so on. And then there are gaps in the students' knowledge of the test procedure, what happens on the test day. And many of these knowledge gaps may not seem very important. They're quite small gaps in students' knowledge. And therefore you might be thinking, well, what's the point of filling them? It's just a waste of time. But I've found that when I help my students become test experts, people who know the test, they know exactly what's going to happen and exactly how many questions and exactly how much time, that gives students a huge amount of confidence. And confidence, something that we've been talking about again and again today, really can have a big impact on students' test scores. So I'm a big believer in filling students' test knowledge gaps because it's quite quick and easy, and it gives students that confidence to feel that they can do this. And then we talked about the third type of gap, which is the thinking gap. And I think there are two main thinking gaps. One is students are not sure how to think critically. Critical thinking is a vital skill in every aspect of the modern world, but particularly important in tests. And if students are not confident about thinking critically, that can affect their score. And the second thinking gap I feel is that students are often unsure how to think about learning. Now, I'm going to be coming back to thinking gaps a little bit later in the session. So for now, we're not going to be continuing to talk about these. So we've talked about these knowledge gaps that we want to try and fill. How can pathways help us? I think when it comes to the language gaps, each book in the series is really carefully constructed, full of useful information that has been chosen specifically to be valuable for students in an academic setting. And because most exams like IELTS and TOEFL are academic exams, I think the books themselves are excellent resources and sources of the kind of language that students need. And for test gaps, I think the books can also give some useful information as well. There's what we call a test correlation chart at the end of the book, and also quite a few exercises within the book that are going to be valuable for the test. So if we talk about grammar gaps, here's a couple of examples from the book. The first one is grammar for speaking, and the second one is language for writing, adjective clauses, and making comparisons. And I'd like you to notice that it doesn't say grammar, it says grammar for speaking. It doesn't say grammar, it says language for writing. These are both grammar points, but the focus is on grammar that's useful for producing natural speech or grammar that's useful for producing natural writing. So it's not just about grammar, it's about producing correct natural language. So this is, I think, very, very useful for students. Everything in the book, I think, would be valuable for test knowledge. Lots of vocabulary gaps, of course. And we tried to find that balance between receptive and productive vocabulary. We've also tried to find that balance of getting the words that are in the sweet spot. Still on vocabulary gaps, there are vocabulary skills in every unit, and these are trying to build students' knowledge of vocabulary. Here's one that actually comes from the book that I wrote, and it's about giving students some tools to go away and self-study in effective ways. This comes back to the point I made earlier about sometimes students don't do the necessary work, the work that's actually going to move them forwards. So here, introducing some free tools that students can use to learn more about synonyms or antonyms, about collocations, or about concordancer. And these are all quite valuable, I think. And we talked earlier about this B2 sweet spot. And I didn't know this when I set out my presentation, but when I looked at the back of the level 3, Pathways level 3, which is the level that I worked on, and it's aimed at B2 level. And of the vocabulary in that book, 60% of words are actually in that B2 sweet spot, and 20% are in that C1 sort of second sweet spot. So we've got 80% coverage of really useful words for the students. So I feel quite proud of the fact that we've got this really useful resource for students. When it comes to pronunciation gaps, a couple of things that we can look at here. One is this a little pronunciation box on linking, the way native speakers make certain sounds join together. So the magazine publishes list of, tov. And then a pronunciation word stress for emphasis, stressing a particular word to add a nuance of meaning. And I'm curious here, which of these two pronunciation points do you think is more useful for students who are going to be taking a test? Is it linking sounds? So we don't say go over there, we say go over, go over there. There's a W sound that gets inserted for what's called euphony, or a smooth, natural, pleasant pronunciation. Or is it stress for emphasis, go over there, not there? So in the chat, please, let's vote. Linking sounds or stress for emphasis, and I'll play the game as I try to get my chat window to appear. Everybody's typing stressed, almost everybody's typing stress. You're either really stressed or you actually mean stress for emphasis, probably the latter. So yes, stress for emphasis is getting the majority of votes. And I think that's right, but for an interesting reason. When we think about pronunciation, we tend to think about it as this sort of global thing. But I think we can usefully look at it in two ways. And one of them is reception. I think linking sounds are really useful for students, but from the point of view of receptive understanding. Students probably need to know that native speakers are going to say go over there with a W sound inserted. But if students try to produce that sound themselves, oh, we should go over there, they may not sound as natural as a native speaker. They almost certainly won't. And speaking itself in a foreign language is very difficult. There's this concept called cognitive load, which is the idea of putting lots of things in your brain that makes it hard to do something. And speaking, it gives a really, really heavy cognitive load for students. Adding this extra thing, oh, now you've got to link these sounds, makes that cognitive load even greater. And that makes it more difficult for students to speak. They're likely to be less fluent, more hesitant, and both of those things are going to affect their scores. So if I were to teach, when I teach things like linking sounds, I'm quite clear with students, look, you need to know this, you'll need to hear it, but you don't have to do it. If you want to do it, fantastic, but I'm not going to be asking you to practice these linking sounds. Stress for emphasis, on the other hand, is incredibly useful for production. That little bit of emphasis, go over there, is enough to change the meaning of the whole sentence. But it doesn't have to require students learning new grammar or learning new vocabulary or anything like that. So I think if we were to teach something about pronunciation, this would be a great one to do, because it can add what we call this nuance, this nuanced meaning. And nuance is one of the things that examiners listen for or look for. A student who has the ability to give this little bit of extra meaning is likely to get a better score than somebody who is less able to do that. So I think stress for emphasis is probably the one that we would find more useful for students. Punctuation gaps. The book has a punctuation section at the back of every book, giving some basic advice about punctuation. And that's useful, of course. But throughout the book, there are also little pieces of advice about how to use punctuation correctly. In this language for writing box that we've already seen, for example, there's a suggestion here to use a comma after the word similarly and with expressions like. So not just teaching students the grammar or the vocabulary, but also teaching them how to use it correctly in terms of punctuation. And then in terms of the book, when we're looking at test knowledge gaps, the books have been designed with information about the tests in them. One of the things that I was asked to do was to give some suggestions for everybody, for the whole team, for things that would be useful related to exams. So there's quite a lot of stuff in there. Here's, for example, is a listening skill related to listening for the order of events. This is a specific question type in TOEFL, and it also comes up in other exams as well. And then an exercise that practices this same thing. Interestingly, this exercise is a TOEFL style question, but it's based on an IELTS style conversation. So trying to balance it out to give students, whatever the test, there's going to be something that's useful for them. And then there's this test correlation chart that we talked about, which lists all the question types and all the skills that are going to be useful for IELTS and TOEFL. And that's at the back of every book. So we're going to fill these critical gaps in students' knowledge. I think it gives us a couple of benefits. Excuse me. The first one is that students are going to be able to use English more accurately and more naturally. They're making fewer mistakes. Their scores are going up. And the students are also going to gain confidence. They're getting confidence because they know the test well, they know how to think, and those things are going to factor in, hopefully, to raise the score. The second suggestion I have, principle I'm going to offer you, is what I call setting challenges for students. In English language teaching, a lot of my friends, a lot of my colleagues think that their job is to nurture students, to care for students, as well as to educate them. And I completely understand. I work here in Canada, and a lot of the students are obviously not from Canada. They've come from countries all over the world. They're here in a new country. They are a little bit homesick, a little bit lonely. They may not have as many friends. Families are far away. They need a little bit of support and care, and I absolutely understand. But when it comes to test classes, I don't think this is the right approach. I think nurturing students can actually hurt their test scores, and I'd like to know why. Chat away, please. Yeah, some excellent answers coming through. Spoon feeding is not helpful. You are absolutely right. You guys are wonderful. You've got the answer, of course. Students are going to learn to rely on others rather than themselves. And in a test, they don't have anybody except themselves. So if they've learned to rely on others, they're not going to be as confident, they're not going to be as successful in the test. And I think also students don't get used to overcoming challenges. They get used to being helped to overcome challenges. But tests like TOEFL or IELTS, they're one huge challenge. And so I think challenging students is not just good, it's the right thing to do. We really should be careful not to help students too much. So I think using principal challenges is really an effective approach in an exam class. I've used this word principled, and it's a word you'll see again. A principal challenge is one that has a specific goal in mind. You're not just giving a challenge to give a challenge. You're giving a challenge that's going to help students learn this skill or improve in that area or be able to do this better. You've got challenges that have a specific goal in mind, and that goal is educational and effective to help students. And you've seen already that I like these sort of little lists. So there are 3 things that we can do, 3 kinds of challenges. The first one is what I call these straightforward test style challenges. I'll give you some examples in a moment. And then what I call challenges that go beyond the test, and micro challenges. Straightforward test style challenges, these are the things that you do in the class all the time. You give students some comprehension questions, a set of reading questions from IELTS, a listening set from TOEFL. You ask them to read or listen, answer the questions, you discuss the answers, you're done. You might ask students to write an essay in the style of an IELTS test or a TOEFL test. You might ask students to deliver a talk, the kind of talk they would do in IELTS or TOEFL. And I'm not going to talk more about this because this is what you do all the time in the class. So how about these challenges that go beyond the test? I'll give some examples in a moment, but I think these challenges have a couple of very specific benefits. The first one is that they can help students to develop skills that are particularly useful for the test, but these are skills that may not develop from straightforward challenges, or may develop from straightforward challenges, but may develop only a little, whereas going beyond the test might help them to develop a lot more. And then the second advantage, I think, is that going beyond the test can be very interesting for students. And I'm sure you know there's lots and lots of research that suggests when students are interested, they're going to learn more, they're going to be more motivated, they're going to be enjoying it more, and this will lead to better results. So we really want to be keeping things as interesting as possible for students. So some examples of these challenges that go beyond the test. One of my favorites is to use software to make the listening faster than 100% speed. So usually I'll set when I get a new group of students, I'll set the speed to about 103%. So it's a little bit faster than the speed it should be. And then once they get used to that, I'll raise it to 104% or 105%. And when they get used to that, I'll go to 106, 107, 108, and so on. And this is incredibly powerful at helping students to develop their ability to listen. Very quickly, students are going to be able to get that skill and be able to listen at faster than normal speed. And when they do this, they take a test and they come back and they'll say something like, wow, the listening section was so easy. Everybody sounded like this. And it wasn't true, of course. They weren't sounding slow, but because they were so used to fast speed in the class, in the test, anything that they heard sounded slower and easier, and their confidence went up, their scores went up, and it was great. Now, we're really lucky. When I first started doing this, which was probably about 20 years ago, it was so difficult to do. I had to get the CD, I had to put the CD in my computer, I had to copy all the files to my computer, I then had to use software that was really slow and very expensive, and one by one I had to slow down, I had to speed up, and then I had to copy those all back to a different CD, and then finally I could use it in the class. And almost always I'd make a mistake, and some of them would be too slow, and it was a nightmare. These days you just pick up your phone and you use your phone, and there's software on the phone that can change the speed immediately. You don't have to do anything, just set the speed to 105% and boom, you can go. So much easier than it was for me. Another example of a go beyond challenge. We can give students less time to answer a set of reading comprehension questions. If the test gives them 20 minutes, like typically IELTS and TOEFL does, then we can give them 19 minutes, or then down to 18 minutes, and then down to 17 minutes. And this is great because it teaches students to work quickly, which is an absolutely vital test skill, and it encourages them to find instead of read. And a quick question for you, please. On this slide, above the red words, what is the most useful phrase? Lots of people suggesting encourage, a few people suggesting less time, but many of you have noticed this particular phrase: to find instead of read. I don't think the reading section of any test is actually a reading section. I think it's a finding section. Students have to answer the questions, and the answers are in the reading passage, but nothing says you have to read the reading passage. All students have to do is to answer the questions. And if they can answer the questions by finding the answers instead of reading everything, they're going to have a huge advantage because they're going to have so much more time. In a typical reading passage, and remember, I'm an item writer, so I'm kind of giving you secret information here. I can't tell you what it is, but you're going to notice it. In a reading passage, I'm writing something like 700 words. Of those 700 words, 400 or 500 are not useful for any of the answers. Those 400 or 500 words are just there to provide information that looks like it might be right, but it's actually wrong. So typically 200 to 300 words, that's where all the information can be found. But students will read all 700 words. So they've just wasted time reading 400 or 500 words that are not actually going to help them. So if we can change our students' thinking, coming back to that idea of this thinking gap, if we can help students to recognize that their job is to find and not to read, then I think we've given students a really valuable tool. And it's just a change of thinking. If their thinking is different, I'm going to find the answer instead of I'm going to read everything. I think we've really helped students. Now, I saw one question in the chat about whether it's okay to do these kinds of challenges with students who are already losing confidence. And I would say absolutely yes, because we can't build students' confidence until they've found that they can do it. And if we talk about this idea of going faster than normal speed, for example, with the listening, we could start it at 95% to give students that confidence. And then we'll go up to 96 and 97. And we do this quite slowly over the course of maybe a week. You might go from 95 to 97, for example. And then the next week, 97 to 100. And then the next week, 100 to 102, for example. And because it's such a small increase each time, almost certainly students won't even notice. And then once they do, you can tell them, hey, look, by the way, we've just listened today at 105% of normal speed. That's faster than you're likely to get on the test, and you can do it. And so that when the students take the test, they are so full of confidence. One more go beyond challenge that I find quite valuable is I like to turn my students, instead of saying you're a test taker, I like to turn them into test makers. And I like to do this by getting them to write their own test style questions. Because in order to write effective questions like the questions in the tests, students absolutely have to understand the topic. They have to know what the test format is and all those things. So they really have to get into the details of the test to be able to write test questions so they become test experts. And micro challenges are really, it's just a fancy name for questions that help students to think about the test or help students to build a test skill, something like that. And because they're really just questions, they don't require any special setup or any special preparation. Very easy to incorporate into your classes, of course. And depending on the kind of question you ask, they can be very quick to answer as well. Some examples of micro challenges that we might ask. You've gone through some questions in a straightforward test style challenge. You ask students to explain why the right answer is right, why the wrong answers are wrong. You might ask students to change something so that if the wrong answer is B, change B so that it's now the right answer. Change the question so that B is the right answer. Change the reading text so that B is the right answer. This kind of change really gets students to think about not just the test, but also the language, and that can be a very valuable way to build their knowledge. You might ask students for a synonym of a word or an antonym of a word, a definition of a word. One thing I like to do sometimes is to stop in the middle of a sentence and say, what is the next word? Because that gets students to really begin to think about English. Now, this idea of micro challenges this is one feature of an approach to teaching that is called demand high teaching. And I have found demand high teaching to be an incredibly valuable and effective tool for teaching. It's actually something I was doing before I learned what it was called. But if you're interested in learning more, demand high, the name was given, and the approach to teaching was described by two writers who you might know, Adrian Underhill and Jim Scrivener. And if you'd like to know more, you can certainly just search for their names and search for demand high, and you'll find useful information about this. Now, why can setting challenges be dangerous? I'm a little bit worried about time, so I'm just going to answer this question myself, if that's okay. Challenges are great, as I've tried to show, but I think it can be a little bit dangerous for a couple of reasons. The idea of a challenge is that it's a tool to build student skills. The challenge itself is just a tool. It's not the challenge that's important, it's the thing that it builds. So if we set challenges that are too difficult, or if we use challenges that are a little bit too common, if we're using challenges too often, I think students may not develop those skills that we're trying to develop. They may not get the benefit. They may actually feel demotivated. And that's going to be a problem. So balance things out, don't use challenges too often. And to get the level right, we want to aim just above students' current level. We want to try and put something that will pull them up, but not so difficult that it's going to be impossible for them to do it. And we want to provide as much support as needed. If we're giving students a challenge, we need to be there to help them overcome this challenge when they need to. So how can pathways help us? Well, there are lots of straightforward test style challenges already in the book. The test correlation chart shows you what they are. And if we're talking about challenges that go beyond the test, or micro challenges, well, I think these are ones that no textbook can incorporate, because these are things that you would want to do as a teacher based on the needs, the specific needs of your students. And nobody's going to know your students better than you. But just the idea of doing something that goes beyond the test, that pushes students beyond the test, is a good one. A quick analogy, you may not notice it from my not very good quality physique. One of my hobbies is running, and every so often I'll challenge myself by running a 10-kilometer race or a half marathon, something like that. And when I do that, before the race, I always go further. So if I'm running 10K, I will train myself to run 12 kilometers, so that on the day of the test, if something goes wrong, if I'm not confident, if I'm not fast, I know I can do it because I've already run 12, therefore 10 should be easy. And that's the kind of idea here. Going back to what the book can do, we've got some straightforward test challenges here. This is an IELTS style summary completion exercise where students have to fill in the blanks with no more than 3 words, that famous IELTS phrase. And here's a little bit more fancy one. This is a diagram completion exercise, which again is quite common in the IELTS test. But also you'll see diagrams sometimes in the TOEFL listening. The benefits of challenging students, they're going to make fewer mistakes, so score is going to go up. The test is going to feel beatable. That's, I think, the big advantage here. The perceived challenge, the feeling that this is difficult, is going to be less. Students will feel, I can do this. and it boosts their confidence, which we've already said can have a big impact on test scores. So the third approach is to focus on test-taking strategies. A strategy is a plan or method that helps us to achieve a goal or perform a task, and we use strategies in every aspect of our lives because they are very effective. Skipping over this. I think there are two broad ways to focus on test-taking strategies. One is to teach strategies to students. We've got students in our class, we're going to share with them some strategies that will raise their score. And the other one is that we can use teaching strategies ourselves. I'm going to call these pedagogical strategies because these are the ones that we're going to be using ourselves in the classroom, not ones that we're going to be teaching to students. But what makes a good strategy? We've talked about strategies. What is a strategy? I think it needs 3 elements. And I'd like to know what you think. Complete each blank with an adjective, please. There's a huge bonus for anybody who gets all 3 of them right. Some good ones, lots of simples, lots of easies. Systematic, that's an interesting one. Effective, that's a good one. But nobody, at least that I've seen, has got all 3. Let's see what they are. Simple, of course, most of you got this. A strategy has to be simple. Simple to explain and simple to understand. If it's too difficult to explain, students are not going to get it. If it's not easy to understand, students are not going to try and use it. It needs to be effective, of course. If we're giving students a strategy and it doesn't work, what's the point? And it needs to be actionable. This is the one that I thought none of you would get. Phew. Actionable in this case means it's easy for students to put into practice. It's something that they can do without any preparation, without any planning, without any equipment. Whatever the situation, they can use this strategy and it will be effective. And to help you, remember, simple, effective, and actionable, I'm giving you a strategy, which is an acronym, C. And because research shows that it's easier to remember things when there is more than one input into your brain, in this case, a word and a visual image, you've got the fancy PowerPoint animation, which I spent way too much time trying to work out. Simple, effective, actionable. Now, teaching strategies is a common idea. You've heard it before, you almost certainly do it. But I think there are 3 issues. One is that strategies are not often taught explicitly. And by that, I mean, we're not just teaching, here's a strategy, use it. We're actually breaking it down and saying, look, here's the first step, this is how we do it. Here's the second step, this is how we do it. And in my experience, that's less common. And because of that, students rarely use strategies systematically. They may use it once or twice, but because they don't have that process yet, they're not going to use it every time. And the thing is, most strategies are better, not the first time or the second time, but the 20th time, the 50th time, the 100th time. When those are strategies that students use all the time, they're going to get more benefit from them. And I think because of these 2 problems, students will often use strategies unthinkingly. And if they're not thinking, they're probably not getting the maximum benefit. So what can we do? Well, these are easy to overcome. We can teach explicitly. We can encourage students to use strategies again and again and again until they become a habit. And we can encourage students to think about what they're doing. So here's a very simple but effective reading strategy. We often talk to our students about skim the text. Well, fine, but how do you skim? Well, often the first and last sentence is enough. If students are reading the first sentence and the last sentence of a paragraph, they're going to get a rough idea of what that main idea is of that paragraph. Sometimes first and last sentence is very short, so read the second last and the second sentence as well. Listening skills strategy. In a listening section of the test, there may be a question. This might be an actual question, so two people are speaking and one person asks a question, or it may be a rhetorical question where one speaker is asking a question that he or she is going to answer. Whenever students hear a question, it's very likely that the answer is going to be important information. So we can suggest that students should listen carefully for and take notes about how the question is answered, what the answer is, because that's likely to be important. And just as I did with that earlier point about reading, what's another strategy on this slide? I'm not going to ask you to put this in the chat, but just have a look and see what you think. And it's a similar point to the one we made earlier about finding. I think it's listen for. When we ask students what preposition do we use with listen, they're going to say listen to. And yeah, that's correct. A lot of the time we listen to this, we listen to that. But the difference between listen to and listen for is active listening and passive listening. When we listen to, we're trying to understand everything. It's quite passive. When students listen for, they're actively seeking out information. They're judging, was that important? Is that going to be useful? And that change, that shift in thinking, that shift in acting from listening to listening for, again, can have a really big impact on students' scores, in my experience. Now, speaking of writing, students have two common problems that are easily fixed. Their essays or their talks are poorly organized, and there's a lot of repetition of ideas, repetition of language. And again, I don't think we're going to have quite enough time for this, but I'm going to give you a strategy that will overcome both of these issues. To give students a strategy for a well-organized answer, I encourage them to follow what I call the ORS pattern, with ORS standing for give an opinion, support the opinion with one or more reasons, and then give additional support, examples, details, and so on. ORS, opinion, reason, support. And then to improve the organization further and to avoid repetition, during the support stage of ORS, I encourage students to answer unspoken questions that the examiners might have. So earlier we talked about going shopping. And if I say yesterday I went shopping, your unspoken question might be, what did you buy? Or where did you go? Or how much did you spend? And I could answer those questions. Yesterday I went shopping. I went to a shopping mall near my home. I didn't buy anything though. Your unspoken question is probably why. I didn't buy anything because I didn't have, I didn't find anything that I really wanted. I needed something special. Why did you need something special? It's my sister's birthday soon. Oh, how old is she going to be? She's going to be 57, for example. Now you can see that by answering these unspoken questions, I really have great organization because there's unity. Everything is related to that original idea of going shopping. So it's fantastic unity. But because every question is different, there's basically no repetition of ideas, no repetition of vocabulary. So it's a very simple idea. But if students are answering unspoken questions, they're going to be avoiding two of those problems of repetition and lack of organization. And the other advantage, the hidden advantage here, is that because students are thinking about what the examiners might want to know, they're actually improving their ability to communicate effectively, because good communication always involves thinking, what does the other person not know? Now, we're almost at the end now. So there are three strategies that I think you can use yourselves, these pedagogical strategies. One of them is to teach difficult things as a process. The other one is to offer opportunities for active learning. And then we can finally help students to develop a growth mindset. We often teach writing as a process, but I think all four skills, all the major skills, reading, listening, speaking, and writing, benefit from being taught as a process. And it's particularly effective, I find, for teaching critical thinking. Critical thinking is often very difficult. It's one of those thinking gaps that I mentioned right at the beginning of the talk. And if we teach critical thinking as a process, we're giving students a tool to be able to think more critically in effective ways. So we don't just tell students to think critically, we break it down. Here's a critical thinking task, here's the process. I'm going to be completely simple here. Too simple, I know, but if we want students to classify something, we might say, here are the 3 steps. Start by looking for similarities among all the things that we're classifying. Then look for differences, and after you've got the similarities and the differences, work together to classify those pieces of information. It's too simple, I know, but it hopefully gives you the idea. And this approach is effective because we can divide a task into many steps, whether it's a critical thinking task or a reading task or a writing task. We divide it into steps. And each step can be very simple. And that's great because it gives students confidence that they can do it. And then it can work with any critical thinking task or in fact, any other task. Now, we talked about this idea of active learning. And I think active learning involves getting students to reflect on what they are learning and why they're learning it. Helping students to think about how to learn better. And to get them to become active learners, we encourage students to reflect. We ask questions, of course, and we answer their questions. And then sometimes we can set open-ended assignments. Open-ended assignments are ones that don't have a beginning or an end exactly. And I often like to set assignments where I don't tell students what they should be doing. I say the assignment is do something that will improve your English. And I let students make a choice about what that should be. And then I'll ask them to report back on what they chose, why they chose it, how they did it. And this is quite a powerful way to really get students to reflect and become active learners who are making choices about what they learn and why they learn it, rather than just being passive learners who are doing what they're told. And then when we come to this idea of a growth mindset and a fixed mindset, I jumped ahead, sorry. There's two adverbs that tell you about growth mindsets and fixed mindsets. The student with a fixed mindset, and the sad expression, says this is too hard. I'm no good at it. It's too hard, suggesting you're never going to be good at it. And the student with an with a growth mindset says this is hard. I'm no good at it yet. And that word yet is incredibly powerful because it has this idea that I will become good at it. I just need to work harder or change how I do it or think a little bit differently or just practice more. And if we can encourage that not yet attitude in students, they're going to be able to develop this growth mindset. And this research that suggests that people with a growth mindset simply do better in almost every aspect of life. How can we help students to develop this growth mindset? We can use strategies. You've talked about strategies. We can challenge students, and we can make it clear to students that errors are a necessary step on the road to understanding. How does Pathways help us? Well, we've got these skill boxes in each unit that these are test strategies. And of course, there are also exercises and tasks in the book that are giving useful strategies. So there's a reading strategy, a listening strategy, an effective speaking strategy. This one is about quoting statistics. Statistics are a way to help students make their writing and speaking look a little bit more natural, look a little bit more supported. And I'm going to give you a super secret complementary strategy here. Examiners never check statistics. It's not our job. If I hear a statistic, I'm like, oh, statistic, nice. But I'm not going to check, is that true that 30% of shoppers were female? So we can encourage our students to use statistics, and if they worry about they don't have them, they can make them up. I'm not saying you should tell your students to lie, but the examiners will never check. And a writing strategy here. And then to encourage this, to fill these thinking gaps to help students become active learners or develop a growth mindset. At the end of each chapter, there is a reflection section that asks students some questions that get them to think about what they've learned, what they would like to learn next. And then lots and lots and lots of critical thinking. The book itself is called Pathways Listening, Speaking, and Critical Thinking, or Reading, Writing, and Critical Thinking. So critical thinking skills, making inferences, categorizing information. Those are the skills to explain what this critical thinking task is involving, and then some exercises, evaluate, or once again, reflect. And the benefits, when students have this focus on strategies, they make fewer mistakes, we hope, because they have a strategy to overcome or avoid mistakes. Once again, they've got a tool. These strategies are tools that can reduce the perceived challenge of the test. Students have got this useful test knowledge. Their thinking gaps are closing because they know how to think better, and they're doing the necessary work. And thank you so much. I'm sorry for running a few minutes over, but thank you so much for giving me some time this morning or this evening, and I really appreciate it. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Christine. So we may have time to answer like 1 or 2 questions. So you can check the chat box or the Q&A and see if there are 1 or 2 questions you can answer. And before that, I would like to, thank you everyone for joining us either in here in the webinar room or on Facebook watching live. So I would encourage every one of you to become a National Geographic Learning fan. If you're in China, you can follow our NGL WeChat site, or you can follow us on our Facebook. Lots of teachers ask about the certificate. So for all of you who joined us in this webinar, you will get a thank you for joining us email. And in the email, you will get a link of the recording of the session and also a survey. At the end of survey, you can get access to your e-certificate. You can also follow us on our webinar site. So ngl-asia.com. So where you can see all the upcoming webinars, and also you can watch all the recordings of previous webinars. So today, Christine actually shared lots of ideas and lots of tips that we can help our students with their exams by using examples from Pathways. I will share in the chat box later the link to the companion site of Pathways. And if you're interested, if you feel it's very useful from this session, I will also encourage you to join our session 2 days later, where our trainer will give you a kind of a demo teach from 1 lesson from Pathways. Okay, it's a reading lesson. All right, so thank you. And Christine, if you find some questions you would like to answer.
Yeah, I saw one question actually. Somebody asked whether it was better to take the exam before teaching it, which I thought was a very interesting question. Yes, if you can. The more you know about the test, the better. I'm a native speaker of English, but I've taken most of these exams myself several times, sometimes because I really wanted to understand what was in the test, what were students going to experience in the test, what were the best things to help them. So that knowledge changed me from an okay teacher, I think, to a much better teacher. I'm still not going to say good, but when I learned the test myself, I